I am Vipin Veetil, an economist with a PhD from George Mason University, and this talk is co-organized by the K. N. Raj Economic Society and the All India OBC Students Association. The title of this talk is The Economics of Caste, Merit and Discrimination. Let me begin this talk with a little bit of a puzzle. You see, in a study about productivity in the Indian Railways, Ashwini Deshpande and her co-author find that the implementation of reservations for Dalits at higher ranking positions of the Indian Railways did not produce any decline in productivity. In fact, their study shows that there was a mild increase in productivity after the implementation of affirmative action. Now, why is this a puzzle? From an economic point of view, this is a puzzle because we typically think that if constraints are imposed on production or consumption for that matter, you get a decline in efficiency, not an increase in efficiency. Consider, for instance, a factory, an automotive factory, which uses a wide variety of inputs to produce cars, and one of those inputs is steel. Suppose there is a rule which says that this factory can purchase steel only from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. We would assume that the efficiency of the factory would decline. Put differently, the factory is likely to operate on a lower cost curve if it had the freedom to purchase steel from anywhere in the world. So why is it that in this particular case, that is in the case of Indian Railways, when a constraint was imposed on who to hire into management positions, why is it that the constraint did not generate a decline in productivity? On the contrary, why is it that the imposition of the constraint generated a mild increase in productivity? See, now I have spoken to numerous friends of mine about this puzzle, each of whom has their own take on it. My own take is rather simple. The constraint did not reduce productivity simply because in the absence of the constraint, Indian Railways was not recruiting on the basis of merit. And this is not peculiar to the Indian Railways. One of the emphasis of this talk is that any government organization, any government bureaucracy has in the absence of constraints like affirmative action, it has little to no incentive to recruit on the basis of merit. Now, why is that? The answer to that question is relatively simple. The incentives of the bureaucrats who run government organizations do not necessarily align with the incentives of the organization itself. More specifically, bureaucrats have fixed salaries, fixed tenures, and in some senses we can think of bureaucrats as selling services to their superiors rather than final consumers. And what does all that mean? That means that there is plenty of space within the government bureaucracy for the bureaucrats to engage in what economists would call preference expression. More specifically, they can engage in expressing their personal preferences, which may hurt the productivity of the organization. And what are the avenues for expressing such personal preferences? Let me speak to you from the field I know best of, which is higher education and the hiring of faculty in higher education. Think about a department like the Humanities and Social Sciences department at IIT Madras. The first avenue for preference expression is when we post an advertisement for a new hire. Should we hire an economist or a sociologist? And if we are to hire an economist, should we hire a macroeconomist or a microeconomist? And within macroeconomics, should we hire somebody who is Keynesian or Austrian? Wide number of choices, wide number of avenues in which to make over which to make decisions. Now note, it is well possible that if someone I know from my community or someone I know who is from with whom I share ideology is seeking job within the institute, that I post an advertisement which is very suitable to that individual. So that, so the process of discrimination really begins from the decision to what decision about what kind of advertisement to post. The second avenue for where, you know, discrimination or preference expression can enter is the question of who to shortlist after people have applied for jobs. So suppose I post an advertisement for a macroeconomist who works in the area of macroeconomics and also finance and specializes in macroeconomics of climate change. And I do this because I know a friend of mine, maybe a family member or somebody who's from my caste community, who's exactly from that area. But I do, at the end of the day, by law, by government regulation, I do have to post a public advertisement. So as soon as I post a public advertisement, numerous individuals will apply, right? Now note that each of these individuals will have PhDs from different parts of the world, different universities. They would have undergraduate degrees from different universities, and they would have published papers in different journals. How do you aggregate the qualities and the variety of qualities that each individual possesses? Now here again judgment enters, and it's an arena where caste sentiments can play a role. The next stage is, once an individual is shortlisted for an interview, question arises as to how to treat the individual in the interview. Should I welcome him or her with a smile? Should I offer him a glass of water? Or should I treat the individual somewhat coldly? And once the individual is present at the interview, what kind of questions should I ask the individual? Understand that many individuals who come for faculty position interviews, some of them already know those who are interviewing them and have known them for 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 years. Other individuals are seeing the people who interview them for the first time. This naturally creates differences in how the two individuals are likely to respond to questions asked in the interview. And then of course there is the issue of what kind of questions to ask. You can always find questions to ask a candidate in the interview which the candidate cannot answer, and it is well possible to ask questions in an interview which a candidate can answer really well. And here again the choice of questions is an arena where caste sentiments and discrimination more generally can enter. And the fourth area is that of constituting the interview committee itself. Who should be members of this interview committee? That itself to some extent determines which candidate would be hired. Now you see, there are clearly several areas in faculty recruitment where caste sentiments and caste forces can play a role in determining who gets hired. It is not merely merit which determines who gets hired as professors and faculty members in higher educational institutions within the government system. Now what kind of preferences are expressed? This is also an important question. Understand that within a government bureaucracy, the preferences that are expressed need not only be caste preferences. You may express preference for people of particular gender, people who speak your own language, people with whom you share religion, people who come from your region of the country, and the list goes on. But the idea is that there is a fair amount of scope to express your preferences which do not necessarily align with the interests of the organization. Now how do you align? So this is the big question. How do you align the interest of a bureaucrat or with the interests of the organization? How do you bring about what economists call incentive compatibility? Now typically in a private organization, this is resolved through what we call residual claimancy. That typically in a private organization, you have somebody who is the claimant to residual income. And what do I mean by residual income? When you run a firm, there are costs to be paid. There are wages to be paid to labor. There are rents to be paid for machinery and infrastructure. And you need to pay interest for those you lent capital to. And once all these fixed payments are made, whatever is left over is called residual income. And the claimants to residual income may be shareholders of the firm, and there are a wide variety of organizational structures which make use of residual claimancy, including limited liability corporations, partnerships, and some of these are of course publicly listed and some are not publicly listed. Nonetheless, there is such a system of residual claimancy. But more importantly, why are residual claimants paid? One of the primary reasons why residual claimants are paid is that they do whatever it takes to align the incentives of the bureaucrats that run the firm with the interests of the firm itself. In fact, one may think of residual claimancy or the income paid of residual claimancy almost wholly as a reward for aligning incentives of the bureaucrats with the goals of the organization. Now, what would happen to discrimination in such a system? What would happen to discrimination in a private competitive system which is based on a for-profit motive and where there are residual claimants? Now, one of the first things that would happen is that the bureaucrats who discriminate, that is the bureaucrats who run these private organizations who discriminate on the basis of caste, they would face the cost of discrimination. And here is why. Imagine a bureaucrat who discriminates against certain faculty members who happen to be relatively good teachers or relatively good researchers. Within a private competitive system, that faculty member is likely to go join another organization. And as good faculty members leave, students too would leave, which means that this private organization would lose profits. And as the private organization loses profits, it will call upon this bureaucrat to stop discriminating, or even in certain cases release the bureaucrat from employment. That is, bureaucrats within private organizations face costs for their discrimination. In the same way that you're likely to purchase fewer apples if the price of apples increases, you're likely to purchase lesser discrimination if the price of discrimination increases. And that is what the private competitive system is capable of doing. Now, understand that this is not merely a consequence of what we would call privatization. Note that the results that I've just described are a consequence of competitive markets, and by competitive markets I mean markets in which there is free entry and exit. Some economists call such markets as contestable markets. They are not the consequence of sheer privatization. And what do I mean by privatization or sheer privatization? If you take a handful of government universities and sell them to private entities, or you issue licenses which allow only particular private entities to operate higher education in India, you are unlikely to see a sizable reduction in discrimination. For sizable reductions in discrimination, you would need a system in which private universities are competing with each other for faculty, for students, and ultimately all of this driven by the profit motive. And irrespective of such a system is likely to function well if we do not put constraints on the nationalities of people who can open universities in India. Now, that said, this whole idea that I have just discussed does have certain empirical predictions. The first of which is that if you look at, because whatever I have spoken about right now does not pertain only to the education sector. This is something that pertains, the mechanics and the dynamics I have described is something that is applicable to all sectors of the economy. And this idea really has a very powerful empirical prediction. That is, if you take the sectors of the economy which are most regulated, that is the sectors of the economy where private players operate under high levels of regulation, you are likely to find greater discrimination than sectors of the economy where regulation is the least. This, of course, may be of interest for some students of economics to pursue. That said, there are two circumstances under which the dynamics that I have described so far do not necessarily generate large declines in discriminative practices. And those circumstances are definitely worth exploring. What are those circumstances? The first of them is if consumers have relatively strong preferences towards consuming goods produced by members of their own caste or members of their own religion, then in the private sector you are likely to get segregated markets or firms that produce only for particular kinds of consumers. For instance, you may get restaurants which only cater to people of particular castes or religions. Another area where the dynamics I have described do not necessarily reduce discrimination or segregation is if workers have strong preferences for working with people of their own caste. In this case, firms may be forced, even profit motivated firms may be forced to employ only workers of a particular caste, because they refuse to work with people of other caste. Note, however, and this is very important, note, however, that such segregation of markets or such segregation of firms need not necessarily reduce the welfare of the individuals who are discriminated against. Consider the following scenario, that there are individuals of group A who discriminate against individuals of group B. That is, individuals of group A have a strong preference not to work with individuals of group B. They do not like to see individuals of group B in their own offices or in their own factory spaces. Now, whether this will reduce the welfare of individuals of group B or not will depend on the size of individuals of group B in the population. Consider a production process where there are economies of scale. And what do I mean by economies of scale? That the cost of production declines as the size of production increases. Suppose there are sizable economies of scale and factories must be of a certain size or workshops must be of a certain size. If individuals of group B are small in number, that is, they constitute only 10% of the population or 5% of the population, in that case, it may be possible that you simply can't run a factory by hiring only people of group B. They are just not enough in number to cater to this production process. In that case, most factories will not hire individuals of group B, only individuals of group A would be hired, and the welfare of individuals of group B would go down even within the private system. However, if individuals of group B constitute a sizable part of the population, 20, 30, 50 or 60%, in that case, individuals of group B too would be hired by firms, but you would get a segregation of firms. Some firms would have only individuals of group B, some firms would have individuals of group A. Nonetheless, you wouldn't see a decline in the welfare of individuals of group B because they too would find productive employment within the economy. Therefore, we've got to be able to distinguish between welfare and segregation. Segregation, both in production and consumption, need not necessarily generate a decline in welfare. That said, what to do about the education system in India? How do we go forward? What kinds of reforms are possible so that we improve not only the quality of education but also allow the education sector to be more fair and open to members of different communities? There are changes to be brought both on the supply side and the demand side. I have so far spoken about the dynamics of the supply side, and therefore let me begin with what to do on the supply side. On the supply side, we do need to remove a fair number of regulations which make it very difficult to open and close universities in India. Understand that once you have a regulation which makes it difficult to close universities, it would naturally make it difficult to open universities. We also have a wide number of regulations which stop foreign universities from coming to India. Lots of American universities, leading British universities wish to open campuses in India. We should allow these universities to open campuses in India. We have regulations which prevent universities from running for profit. Understand that there are lots of entrepreneurs in the world who would like to offer quality education in India, but they would have to raise the capital either in a stock market or through some sort of venture capital fund, and the people who give this capital do need rewards, and these rewards come from profits. So we do need to open up the education sector to the for-profit enterprise. What about on the demand side? Well, we are a country where lots of students cannot afford high quality education without government subsidy. They do come from families which are too poor to allow them to pursue higher education. So far, our way of funding higher education has been to transfer tax money directly to universities. Understand that when you transfer tax money directly to universities, you are in some senses giving money to bureaucrats who sell their services not to the final consumer but really cater to other bureaucrats within the system. And this is one of the reasons why the quality of higher education in India is terribly poor. The way forward is really to start funding students rather than universities, which is give each student who qualifies to pursue higher education a certain voucher, and the student is free to use this voucher in any university of his or her choice. What this would mean is that the bureaucrats, whether they are government bureaucrats or private bureaucrats, would now be under pressure to do what it takes to attract these vouchers and do what it takes to attract these students. the final consumer suddenly becomes the student rather than other bureaucrats. And this too is likely to generate a sizable decline in discrimination and a sizable increase in the quality of education that is provided in this country. With that, let me sort of make a final remark before concluding this talk. And the final remark is the following. A few months ago, a committee formed by the Government of India, chaired by the director of IIT Delhi, submitted a report to the Ministry of Education. It's called the Ram Gopal Committee, I believe. And one of the recommendations of the committee is that IITs must be excluded from implementing reservations in the hiring of faculty, in the promotion of faculty and the likes. But you would notice, now that you've listened to my talk, you understand that within the government system, as it works presently, there is little to no incentive to not express caste preferences. To put differently, there is little to no incentive to hire on the basis of merit only. But if you read the Ram Gopal committee report, you would see them making this claim again and again, that indeed if IITs are made to recruit to implement reservation, then the quality of instruction and the quality of research in IIT would go down. Right? The presumption is that in the absence of reservation, hiring is on the basis of merit only, and this is not true. This is not true in theory, and we don't see any evidence, empirically speaking, which favors this position. Therefore, there are serious reasons to doubt not only the recommendations but also the beliefs upon which the recommendations of the Ram Gopal committee are based. Now, I have concluded this talk. But let me take some questions, and I have been sent some questions by the K.N. Raj Economics Society, and unfortunately time doesn't allow me to address all the questions. There are some wonderful questions that have been sent across, but I would actually try to address some of the questions. The first question is from Mr. Justin George, who is the head of the department at St. Paul's College in Kerala. Right, and the question is, comment on the argument that reservation enhances productivity in workplace. Okay, it's a very difficult question because the answers depend on the particular circumstances of the workplace and the particular circumstances of the system within which the workplace is embedded. Within the government system, there is the possibility that reservation enhances productivity, because if before reservation hiring was not on the basis of merit, the implementation of reservation can bring in some meritorious people, which generates an increase in productivity. But if you have contestable markets, if you have a private system which is open, then if firms are already at their optimum, the implementation of reservation is unlikely to generate any increase in productivity. They may in fact generate a decline in productivity. So it actually depends on the exact system within which the workplace is operating. So it's not only about the workplace, but the larger system within which the workplace operates. It's a difficult question, naturally. The next set of questions is from Vinayakan, who is a member of the K.N. Raj Economic Society, and his first question is, could you comment on the economics of discrimination as explained by Becker, and do you think extensions of his work need to be done in the present scenario within the Indian setting? Those of you who have the second question comes from Vinayakan, who runs the K.N. Raj Economics Society. His question is, could you comment on the economics of discrimination as explained by Gary Becker? Do you think extensions of his work need to be done in the present scenario within the Indian setting? Now, you will notice that a lot of the arguments that I have made come straight out of Becker's Nobel lecture, or straight out of Becker's work more generally. Now, one extension, and I don't know if you could call it a mere extension of Becker's work, it would be more sort of an extension of Gordon Tullock's work on bureaucracy than Becker's work on discrimination, is to actually start thinking of bureaucrats as not serving the final consumer, but actually serving other bureaucrats. They are selling services, but the services are not being sold to students. The services are being sold to other bureaucrats in some senses, right? Because their promotions and the resources they have access to depend on senior bureaucrats. So bureaucrats really sell services to senior bureaucrats, not final consumers. And within this model, you will need to involve the final consumers as people who pose constraints through the electoral process, because the final consumers do vote through the electoral process and they elect politicians who put some pressure on the bureaucrats, right? So we need to in some senses start developing models of bureaucracy where the bureaucrats sell services to other bureaucrats who are at superior positions, but this process of selling services to higher bureaucrats is constrained by the political process where the final consumer votes once in 4 or once in 5 years. I think that would be a wonderful area to sort of work in, and there's a lot of material in India to work on along these lines. The second question by Vinayakan is, how powerful do you think is economics as a tool to fight caste and caste discrimination in India? This again is a difficult question. The question of caste goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years, and it's a question which spans the space of political life, cultural life. It spans our life as individuals. It spans questions of ethics, and it spans questions of human psychology. So there is only so much that economics can do, but there are sizable changes that can be brought about in the expression of caste, or there are sizable costs that can be imposed upon individuals who express caste preferences if we become a more free economy. Okay, that's sort of my short answer to that very difficult question. Next question is by Nandu S, who is a research associate at IIM Kozhikode. Is economic reservation a good replacement for caste reservation? This again is a good question. If you have a system where discrimination is on the basis of caste, then that problem will not be solved if you give reservation on the basis of economic status. Right? So do understand that under the present Indian system, whether it be government or the private, because the present Indian private system is not an open competitive system, it's not the kind of system that I am talking about. In both the present Indian government and private system, discrimination, culturally speaking, is on the basis of which caste you come from. It is not that rich Dalits, they may be treated somewhat differently from poor Dalits, but it is not that rich Dalits are treated equally as if they were members of the upper caste, and therefore reservations based on economic criteria doesn't resolve the problem for us. The next question is from Anup Kutti, who is a research scholar at IIM Bangalore, and Anup asks, researchers have found significant caste based discrimination in the appointment of senior management in large firms in India. How do we tackle this? Again, if you follow Becker, there are kind of the way to tackle this would be to make markets more contestable, that you allow more firms to come in and you allow more capital to come in. In some cases, if workers have a strong preference, or board members have a strong preference for being with other members of their community, then within the private system the only solution is to create an environment where Dalits and members of the Bahujan community can set up firms of their own, right? And that is very well possible. The only thing that Dalits and members of the Bahujan community in general lack to some extent is capital, and therefore it's very important to allow for capital inflows into India, and that's likely to generate sizable declines in the interest rate. And we also need to remove regulatory hurdles which prevent members of the Dalit and Bahujan community from starting firms of their own. So there is no simple solution. The only solution really is to allow markets to be more contestable, which is likely to yield results over a long period of time. Okay. And the last question is from Alan, who is a master's student at the Madras School of Economics,
And he asks, do you think reservations in key administrative positions is essential to end the Brahmanism in Indian academic community? I would tend to agree within the current government system. In fact, this is also an area where there is sizable work to be done. Understand that voting is not something that happens only once in 4 years or once in 5 years. Voting happens every month, every year, every 6 months. Committees vote. The board of governors of IITs vote. The board of deans, committee of deans within IIT votes. The heads of department and the committees formed by the heads of department vote. There is something called the department consultative committee within our department which votes. And there are lots of these committees formed by bureaucrats which vote on a regular basis. And members of the Bahujan community are excluded from these committees. So it's very important for us to implement affirmative action so that we too are able to vote in places where decisions are made about allocating resources within our country, particularly when those resources come from the tax money. Right? So this is sort of very important. But this is also an important area for economic students to work on. If you look at the work on social choice theory, by and large, the work of Arrow and Amartya Sen, by and large, this work looks at how preferences of people can somehow be aggregated into some sort of a social preference. And they look at whether voting mechanisms are capable of doing this. But really, from our point of view, there is a much bigger problem. It's not merely a question of we are voting every once in 5 years and how these preferences get aggregated. But our problem is really we are left out of lots of committees in which voting happens. So there is in some senses, the question of voting within bureaucracies and voting within committees and subcommittees of bureaucracies, voting that determines the embeddedness within bureaucracies, which remains to be studied. So there are lots of interesting questions to study in India from an economic point of view. But let me end this talk here. Thank you for listening, and let me thank the K.N. Raj Economic Society and All India OBC Students Association for giving me an opportunity to deliver this talk. And below this link you would also find a PDF document with some references. And for those of you who would like to work on any of the topics that I've mentioned in this talk, do feel free to reach out to me. Thank you very much and have a good day.